This is the Human Action Podcast with your hosts, Jeff Deist and Dr. Bob Murphy.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back once again to another episode of the Human Action Podcast. We're joined today to discuss the midterm, the punishing midterm, which just took place this week by our old friend Dan McCarthy. I'm sure many of you in Mises Institute and Ron Paul circles are very familiar with Dan and his work. He's actually edited and created an introduction to a new book, an old book, The Conservative Affirmation by Wilmore Kendall, which David Gordon has already reviewed for our site and which I have promised Dan that I'm going to read over the Christmas holidays. But nonetheless, he's also, of course, the editor of Modern Age, which is published by ISI, which is just an excellent publication if you're interested in subscribing to that. So Dan, here's my first takeaway, and I'm going to be the typical obnoxious, Fed-obsessed person here, is that this election shows that there's basically zero political will in this country to deal with any of what I would consider the structural issues of things like war and empire and debt and the dollar and entitlements. That's just off the table. We're talking about trans or abortion or whatever we're talking about.
Yeah, I think you're partly right there. So, the Republicans went into this election looking at the inflation numbers and thinking, okay, this will just automatically give us a red wave. This will automatically give us control of both branches of Congress. And, they were happy to talk about inflation, but what are they actually going to do about inflation? What kind of program do they have? What understanding do they have that connects how awful inflation is with the things that government has been doing recently and what they're going to do differently that would stop more inflation from happening? I think the Republicans utterly failed to make that case. And as a result, voters were content to go with the status quo. And that's what I think is kind of the bottom line of this election, that it's not so much a victory for Democrats who are going to wind up almost certainly losing control of the House. Mm-hmm. There's still some vote counting going on right now, but that looks like it's going to happen. The Senate is going to remain either 50-50 or 51-49, but it's basically, not exactly a blank check for either party. What the public did is basically it just punted. It decided not to make any kind of firm choice about direction. And if you look at the state of both the Democrats and the Republicans right now, maybe it's not so surprising that the public hasn't decided one way or another. I mean, a lot of us would like to believe that, things are so bad under Biden that people just automatically go for whatever alternative is out there. But I think the public, maybe with good reason, wants to see something a lot more substantial than the Republicans have presented so far.
So can I just push back a little on that, Daniel, or not push back, but ask you to clarify? Because, yeah, as Jeff said, I mean, it's, you hear these analyses, and the Republicans should have done much better, if history is any guide, in terms of the off year for the White House out of power group, and given the state of the economy. And so it sounds like you're saying, it's because it's not enough that the economy's bad, inflation's bad, that the Republicans didn't explain why they would do anything better. But are you saying in previous cycles throughout U.S. history, there was an articulate explanation, as opposed to just the public saying, I don't like the way things are right now, let me give the other guys a chance?
Sometimes there has been. So think about the late 1970s, for example. You have the Jimmy Carter era. Things are generally going very badly. You've got inflation. And Republicans and conservatives were able to come up with the idea of supply-side economics, the idea of, Jude Wanniski writing, on a napkin, various ideas that would provide, in very simple terms, the idea that big government was a large part of the problem, if not the primary part of the problem. Now, they were not, of course, going out there and talking in detail about monetary policy for the most part, but the Republicans were at that time able to put together at least, a skeleton of an idea that looked plausible for an explanation of what was wrong with our economy, and that, worked out very well for them with the election of Ronald Reagan. It's not the case that every election is going to work that way. But it seems to me that what we saw in 2020 with the congressional elections for the Senate and the House is very similar to what we saw just now. Basically, in 2020, the Democrats thought, okay, you have COVID, you have the economy crashing as a result of COVID, and you have Donald Trump being a very controversial president with very low approval ratings. Therefore, we're just automatically going to take over. Well, they already had control of Congress, but they expected to expand their control, and instead they lost seats. This year, Republicans, too, were relying on kind of autopilot to put them in power. And that was a mistake. I think right now the public is kind of disillusioned with both parties. They are worried about the state of the country. But in the absence of any kind of clear, persuasive alternative, they're simply voting for the incumbents. And if you look, I mean, like I say, they're still counting votes, but basically, as of the end of election night, no incumbent senator and no incumbent governor had lost. So I think that's it's a sad commentary because most of these guys have a lot of culpability for what's going on, but nonetheless, the public just seems to be in a mood to address the nation's uncertainties by sticking with what they know in terms of politics.
A couple of things come to mind for me. One is it's a bit humiliating that we can't count these elections the same day. I think all this early and absentee voting is absolute nonsense. Unless you're infirm or you're overseas with the military or something, it's voting day. If we're going to have this sacred democracy, then you should have to show up. And that should be counted the same day. That's an embarrassment for America. And I also think there's an awful lot of subterfuge going on in that. I don't know if it's enough to swing a particular election. But let me throw this out to you guys. Are we at a point now where we just have to acknowledge that abortion's pretty popular in America?
Well, I don't know about that. I mean, the issue's gone back to the states since the Dobbs ruling. Different states have had different approaches. Most of the time when a popular referendum has been put on the ballot, the pro-choice side, the pro-abortion rights side, has wound up winning that.
Right.
And that's true whether you're talking about very expansive referenda or whether it's referenda that would be somewhat restrictive that get defeated. Nevertheless, this is something that I think the pro-life movement should have been prepared for. Unfortunately, it wasn't, and it's understandable why it wasn't. There was a lot of focus on Roe for the past 40 plus years. But you have an important job of persuasion that now has to take place, where you actually explain why you believe that life begins when it does. And you can't just, again, automatically assume that people are going to possess the knowledge about either fetal development or the nature of human rights, just as you can't take for granted that they understand inflation and monetary policy. I think education has been a real weakness for the conservative movement as a whole, and certainly for Republicans. And they're paying a price for this now.
Well, I think progressives should be celebrating Dobbs. I mean, look what they're going to get. Look at I believe it's Montana, for example, passed by 500,000 votes, something like 52-48, basically voting down a heartbeat bill of sorts. That what occurs when a baby is born, actually born with a heartbeat. So I guess looking back, progressives were just dead wrong about Dobbs. It might be a great victory for them.
Yeah, you often get a reaction. Sorry, Bob, but you often get a reaction to the things that the Supreme Court does. So, in a terrible, perverse way, but a way that was, ultimately quite significant, Roe was actually a benefit to conservatives in the sense that it gave them something very clear to be opposed to organize against, and to really, work on getting different kinds of justices and judges appointed to the courts. Whereas now, that's been flipped over. Basically, because the Supreme Court doesn't have... It's funny, because the Supreme Court is generally, it polls very well in terms of how much people like it compared to Congress or compared to, the presidency. And yet, ultimately, it doesn't enjoy the kind of legitimacy even that those other branches do. And the other branches certainly have their own compromised legitimacy. But as a result, when the Supreme Court hands down an edict that voters have no say in, it's very easy for the people who are on the losing side of that edict to basically say, aha, not only are we losing a political battle, but we're actually, not even getting a chance to fight unless we organize very intensely and work very hard to change state laws, ultimately, elect, members of Congress and start changing those judges again. So it's perverse, but the Supreme Court can wind up giving an advantage to the side that doesn't have control on it.
I want to ask you, Dan, you're just following up on what Jeff said there. So certainly the progressives, and I've even seen some people on the right just saying things like, hey, we warned you guys that, abortion was going to be huge, and, whatever you think about it, like, you should have seen this coming. Do you agree that that's a major factor in terms of why the normal calculus didn't seem to hold up, that, with the economy, with Biden's approval ratings, being in the tank, that the Democrats should have gotten crushed, and yet they didn't, and it's because of this, and maybe there was a lot of turnout among younger people for Democrats because of abortion. I mean, that was the only message. That and January 6th were the only things I heard people harping on in terms of Democratic candidates. There was a attorney general at Massachusetts who just kept showing ads of her speaking to some group and saying how she was going to stand up for a woman's right to choose. And I was like, well, what does that mean? You're like going to selectively enforce the law? Like, what does that even mean if you're the attorney general? But nonetheless, the people applauded, and that was her campaign rhetoric. So my question is that actually correct, that was a major thing? Like, if you look at certain races, like, is that the reason that it didn't go a certain way, or is that more like just what the progressives are saying? Exposed?
No, I think that proved to be correct. So I was skeptical going into the election that abortion would have quite the significance that progressives were attaching to it. And I have to say I was wrong about that. And if you look at the exit polls and the breakdown of how different demographics voted, what you find is that unmarried women voted for Democrats by something like 30 points or so, maybe even a little more than that, which is just absolutely overwhelming. And younger voters also had a very strong bias towards the Democrats. So these things, they certainly prevented a red wave from occurring. And I'm sure there are, numerous races all across the country that really were changed as a result of this. So abortion wound up being pretty significant. Dobbs wound up being significant and helping progressives more than conservatives. And also, I have to say, and this is really dismaying, but this blatant vote buying that Joe Biden engaged in of forgiving student loan debts, I think that paid off as well. And so, a lot of young people, just a huge number of millennials and Generation Z, cast their ballots for Democrats. And again, if it weren't for them, if it were just an election of people 30 and older, you would have had probably the red wave. But Joe Biden succeeded, actually, in bribing those voters, or at least incentivizing them, rewarding them to continue voting Democrat and to do so in huge numbers. And, so his cynical ploy paid off there.
I remember reading Clarence Thomas's biography or autobiography, and he talks about when he arrived at the Supreme Court, he still had student loans. He was a Supreme Court justice at that point, I guess in his 50s or his 40s, I can't recall. I guess 40s. So, Bob, I don't think the Attorney General of Massachusetts has to pay one iota of attention to what the Supreme Court says, but, I'm a radical guy in that respect. So I want to take this back to Dan McCarthy. Has Tuesday changed your thinking at all about radical federalism or secession?
Not exactly, but my criticisms of sort of secession at least are that it's impractical, and in general, small states, small nations wind up getting bullied by large states and large nations. And in the case of the United States, if you subtract perhaps the state of Idaho from the United States as a whole, Idaho would wind up getting completely run roughshod over by the United States as a whole. And actually, what happens is you take out those more conservative voters from the state of Idaho, the rest of the United States would be, incrementally worse than it had been before, and even more likely to bully a small state like Idaho. Now, that said, there are certainly I'm in favor of very strong federalism, at the state level. I believe that, states should have a high degree of, autonomy. I believe people should be engaged, with their states more than with the federal government. And really, where I part ways with some of my libertarian friends, I do think there is a role for the federal government in basically protecting localities from some forms of globalism, and especially, whether it's economic globalism or foreign threats or what have you. But I do believe in decentralizing power, and obviously, this election and so many other elections make a great case for that. And I would just say that, we have to be aware of how difficult, the situation really is. That, we have corporate America oftentimes against us, as well as the federal government. We have, a whole array, media, which is especially social media, gets to your children no matter what state they may be living in or what country they may be living in. And of course, the United States federal government, it's not like it, wants to observe the banking privacy rules of Switzerland, or, allow anyone to have, the degree of financial autonomy that they had even back in the 20th century. So, no, but you certainly need decentralization of power. And, I think that, and I actually think this election is more proof of that, because both this election and also 2020, you saw that, the nation as a whole is not getting behind one party or the other for Congress, for either the Senate or the House. Which means, these states that have very different personalities, they should be, free to have the kinds of laws that they think are appropriate.
But I have to disagree in part. In other words, I already think D.C. is bullying Idaho. And when it comes to the same animating impulse on the left that would make secession potentially, and I'll be frank here, a hellscape, a pragmatic nightmare. That same animating impulse also applies to the kind of states' rights or federalism, the softer version of that we might propose. So the only way the left will give up an inch of ground anywhere, an inch of influence, power, legal authority, political authority anywhere, is basically if they get punched in the face. So two very interesting things have happened, in part due to COVID, but they were already happening before, which is that the Texas and Florida appear to have potentially turned redder than they were. And a big part of the progressive doctrine of inevitability was that demographic changes are going to swamp Texas and Florida, turn them blue, and then the Republicans will never win another national election under the Electoral College, and that'll be that. Now, that doctrine of inevitability, that mindset, that psychology has been challenged in the last couple of years by DeSantis and by, I'm not a fan of Greg Abbott, but whatever. And I think that's the punch in the face, along with Trump beating Hillary, along with Brexit. That's the punch in the face that the left needed to actually say, hey, gee whiz, maybe we do kind of have to negotiate with these deplorables because there's more of them than we thought, and they're living longer than we thought, and whatever it might be. So, I'm just not sure that with the framework we've got, with people viewing the Supreme Court as the law of the land, or just absolutely nonsensical misunderstandings of the constitutional framework, I'm not sure that what we're proposing in terms of radical decentralization is any more radical or utopian than the idea we're going to coexist with the left somehow under current conditions. I mean, I understand that all this has to be fleshed out, and this is very, very tough stuff. But being yoked to the left is something that they're for because they imagine that they're going to swamp the right eventually. And if they start to question that, then maybe they will be more amenable to the kind of federalism we would want.
Well, I think that's a case my friend Frank Buckley also makes about secessionism. Frank wrote a book on secessionism about a year and a half ago.
The great Frank Buckley, I will say.
Yeah, and he said that, even if secession was impossible, basically, it was nonetheless an idea worth talking about and pressing upon because it would force the other side to negotiate. It would force progressives to understand we're serious enough about this that you had better, be willing to back off of some of the, sort of impositions that you're putting on us. That said, it seems to me that one of the things that I worry about with not just secessionism per se, but with the entire constellation of ideas related to that. So the Benedict option is another example of this. I worry that all of this has a basically retreatist, attitude towards it. The idea, well, if we can just get back into our bunker, we'll be safe then, and they won't be able to get inside and hurt us where, we're fortified. I think that's completely wrong. They're going to get you no matter where you go. And again, they'll get you through, your economic relations with corporate America. They'll get you through the mass media. If Idaho were a separate country, there would be a color revolution in Idaho. There would be, think about the history of the United States with respect to the neighbors we have, right? Do we have a neighbor we haven't invaded? We invaded Mexico. We invaded Canada. The islands off our coast, they all, get to experience the generosity of America's, sort of liberating firepower. This would be the same sort of story. So actually, I think you have to be more aggressive. You have to be capable of beating the left right here at home, right here in the United States, which is difficult. But, here, and you have a lot of people you can draw upon, even in states like California, right? So California it's still a deep blue state. It's a total wreck. People are leaving because it's so bad. But, there are a huge number of disaffected Californians who we should be appealing to and drawing upon and trying to do whatever we can to mobilize. Now, politically, that may be a dead end for now. But knowing that they're out there, they have, some economic power. They have, certainly the ability to speak out. All of that, these are allies worth calling upon. Whereas I think the more we split up, actually, the more vulnerable we become.
Let me just chime in on that point, Daniel. And again, a lot of this stuff is sort of just strategic weighing of different possibilities and a judgment call. But if you're getting absolutely trounced, like sometimes even the best military commanders know their strategic retreat is the way you save your army from getting destroyed. And to me, it's not like, well, oh wow, they got us on the ropes. Well, by gosh, we're gonna push it. Like it's just been we're so proud that Matt Walsh goes out and makes a documentary showing that actually, if you doubt what a woman is, then we can get you 3 steps into the argument. Am I right? And they've got us so back on the ropes that we're fighting over what a woman versus a man is. I mean, this is incredible how much ground, to me, the progressive left has taken in academia and the media and the setting the terms of the debate. That would have been inconceivable 20 years ago, that right now this is what we're where the fight now, what we're squabbling over. And so, yeah, to me, I think you're right. Idaho, that's why I wrote, for people who don't know, if you go to texascommonsense.com, excuse the plug, I have a pamphlet on why Texas is the logical place. If something's going to break away, Texas makes sense for the reasons you say, Daniel. And I would just say Mexicans pay less money to Washington, D.C. right now than people in Idaho do.
Bob, with all the trouble facing America, you have your grubby plug. Look at you.
That's right.
No, I mean, there's good strategic reasons to think of a place like Texas or Florida, which, for geostrategic reasons, right? Because they have coasts, they have, a lot of advantages. They're large. Now, but Texas, though, I mean, you have Austin, right? And Austin is not only significant as the center of the state government, a place of a lot of university activity, but also you have influxes of California companies and others, which are often bringing the same sort of employees that you have in California itself. Many of these employees are people who tend to vote left wing. So when I think about the potential for Texas to turn blue, or at least to change its philosophy, I'm partly worried about immigration coming from Mexico, but I'm actually also worried about this immigration coming from economic refugees from California and elsewhere.
Yes.
I don't think Texas is so sort of strongly, deeply red that, if Texas were its own country, it wouldn't have many of the same sorts of problems that we have in the United States right now. It had all of them, to one degree or another. And, I don't see that as being a solution. You're right that, you can't fight every battle and that there are good times for strategic retreats, but you also can't ever win a war by always having strategic retreats. You eventually have to advance and actually have to smash the enemy. And if you can't do that, if you're always going to keep trying to get to a smaller and smaller circle of people that you think you can save, eventually, you're going to be Winston facing Big Brother. Maybe you can save your own conscience up against the monster, but you're not going to have anyone around you that you can call upon or work together with in order to beat this.
Okay, but is D.C. too far gone? In other words, even if we had 100 Dan McCarthyites installed in the next administration, president, vice president, head of all the cabinets, head of all the executive agencies, you would still have that vast bureaucratic state. You would still have all of the structural problems we have. You would still have academia, media, corporate America, tech dominated by progressives. So I'm not sure how we ever or anyone ever captures the federal apparatus and turns it towards different ends.
Yeah, basically, maybe cite 2 things here. One of them is the late, great Gary North. And Gary North was, quite optimistic that precisely because of the size of the federal bureaucracy and all that it was doing, that it was going to be, bringing about its own destruction and collapse and incompetence. My old friend Don Devine at the Fund for American Studies, worked for Reagan's Office of Personnel Management. He also, certainly did some advising to folks in the Trump administration. And, he says it's gotten far worse now than it was, back during the Reagan days. But this is, this massive apparatus, as terrible as it is also very ineffective and just, it can hardly do even the things it wants to do, let alone doing any of the things that, the services that other people want it to provide. So in that sense, I think that, it's a terrible thing, but it's also not quite as omnipotent as we sometimes fear that it is. The entropy is a force that we can use to our advantage, as well as, being a force that often works against us. And what we need to do, and what I worry that we're not doing, is, strengthening our localities. So even though on the question of, a term like secession or national divorce, I have my quibbles, and I don't like the idea that, there is a kind of excessive optimism in the idea of retreat here. I certainly do believe that we have to engage in creating institutions locally and within our states and, sort of outside of D.C. that are capable of withstanding a collapse or capable of withstanding, a increase of entropy within our country. There is a fellow I talked to from another country told me that the concept his people employ is that of state proofing, that basically you have to state proof your communities locally so that whatever may happen with the central authority in your country, you're still capable of having a good life and a life with your neighbors, and have things work relatively well, even if you have a very hostile power in the nation's capital. So that, while it may not be quite the same thing, or as secession or national divorce, is I think very much parallel. I would just say that you also need the aggressive component, right? The politically aggressive component of going out and hitting your enemies where they are, and not just a defensive component of retreating away from them.
Well, what do you think happens structurally with some of the problems I mentioned at the top of the show? We now appear to be heading into an environment where interest rates are going to rise to where debt service is the single biggest line item in the congressional budget every year, more than Social Security, Medicare, national defense. So given the political environment, how will we, or why would we ever grapple with the dollar, interest rates, debt, entitlements?
Well, I think eventually the pain becomes a little too much to ignore, and we'll see that in terms of diminished, investment opportunities here in this country. We'll see it in terms of, just basically as Austrian economists above all know very well, we've had an economy that has been, basically living on methamphetamines or living on steroids for, at least 20 years and probably a lot more than that, where basically we've been relying upon loose money policies from the Fed in order to, supply a degree of liquidity, which has been able to keep things afloat that otherwise would not have been able to sustain themselves. So all of this is now, we're starting to feel the pain, although we're also, I think, no closer to getting to, realism in terms of our economic institutions than we were, even a few years ago. So there's going to be a lot more pain in the future. And one of the, sort of paradoxes that a conservative like myself confronts is, on the one hand, you don't want people to experience all this pain, especially if it, radicalizes them politically or whatever. There's a lot of danger in this. When you have something like the Great Depression, or when you have something like, Weimar Germany, sometimes people will go to really far extremes in order to try to, meet that. And they go to irrational extremes to try to meet it. But on the other hand, reformist measures can only stave off the inevitable. And sometimes, it feels like not only are we dealing with all of the difficulties of, the money and credit system that have been skewed for a very long time here, but that, much of our economy as a whole kind of feels like a Ponzi scheme that's going to eventually stop being able to add new people buying into it. And of course, what we've done is we've tried to, globalize that Ponzi scheme. But even there are limits to how far it can go.
Well, yeah, and I think there's probably not as much of a chasm between our views, Daniel, as the discussion might have indicated. That it's not. I'm not saying, let's put all our chips strategically on secession and then forget everything else. That I think they're all complementary. That yes, individual households just stocking up, getting ready on things, homeschooling people, your children and so forth. Like that's all added, as you said. And I guess Buckley, I haven't read that, but has alluded to that. Just whether it's actually executed or just the threat of it, if people know that some states are going to break away if we're too crazy on the progressive front, that might keep them in check even in the solidly blue states, because they just they don't want to lose a big chunk of their own population, perhaps, who would just leave and go to Texas if Texas were to peel off. So there's those elements, but beyond all that is the issues Jeff is bringing up. I think at some point in the not too distant future, the dollar is going to crash. That system is going to implode, at least for a while, and you're going to have de facto secession, like just localities just ignoring the feds. And if the dollar crashes against other currencies, a lot of Washington's power evaporates overnight. And so that, they officially, they might all be in violation of the law, but it'll be sort of like in Colombia, where huge areas are just run by the drug lords and, it's illegal, but what are you going to do?
Well, right. I think, whether it's a collapse that then, forces people to relocalize their economies and relocalize their politics, or whether it's, simply a sort of accumulation of entropy within the machine such that it stops being able to produce even the kinds of results that it, produces right now, where it is able to pay off some of its clients and able to keep up, at least an aura of mystique. And I think that's, sort of diminishing by the day. So one way or the other, I think people are going to be, compelled to look back to more localized resources. But in the interim, I think you have to keep up the battle on multiple fronts, including the ones that, you have access to through the federal system and the federal government.
Dan, what do you think Tuesday means for foreign policy?
Well, it doesn't really change much because there just wasn't a lot of alteration in either the House or the Senate. I think J.D. Vance getting into the Senate is a very good sign. He's someone who's been very critical of an adventurous foreign policy and, has been willing to take some slings and arrows from people who say, oh, you're not sufficiently pro-Ukraine, therefore you must be a bad person. And Vance is actually saying, no, you're eventually going to have a negotiated settlement or a nuclear war, at the end of this, horrible situation, this horrible war. And the sooner you have a negotiated settlement, the better that's going to be. So I think J.D. Vance is a great, encouraging sign right there. There are a few others as well. I guess there's still some vote counting going on in Washington State as we record this. Mm-hmm. So I don't know that Joe Kent's, district has been decided yet. But if he makes it in, he too will be a voice for a relatively more restraint. He's not, he's not Ron Paul. Of course, no one else is Ron Paul. But, Joe Kent would be a move in the right direction with our foreign policy. So incrementally, there are some, signs of hope and some good changes here. And then Ron DeSantis himself, I've heard him speak about foreign policy. He doesn't do it a lot, of course, as governor of Florida. But I heard him give some remarks, in early 2021 to a closed-door audience where if he had wanted to, he could have pandered to neocons and GOP insiders, and he could have said, that we're going back to, George W. Bush's foreign policy. And the room I was in at the time would have applauded for that. But he didn't do that. In fact, he said that, we need to continue to, not get into foreign wars. And he basically sounded almost like Donald Trump. So I'm cautiously optimistic that someone like Ron DeSantis is also going to improve foreign policy.
But we know our neoconservative friends are equally comfortable in either party and any administration.
Well, is it true though? Do you guys agree? It seemed like whatever else he may have done poorly, that Donald Trump did make it okay again for right wingers to not want to police the world, and that wasn't viewed as, being airy-fairy, oh, kumbaya, like the fact that right now the Republicans want to be friends with Russia and it's the Democrats who demonize them, like that. It's like Dr. Strangelove and it flipped the roles. And I know there's more things involved than just Donald Trump, but it seemed to me like he gave everybody permission to do that.
Yeah, but as quickly as it happened, it could also go into reverse, is the thing to keep in mind. So, even though Donald Trump, basically exiled a lot of neocons, people like Bill Kristol wound up being totally exposed as a leftist that they've always been. There are a lot of others who are prepared to, adjust, trim their sails, and get back in with the next Republican administration. Of course, Trump himself put in people like John Bolton, although, quite frankly, I think John Bolton did less harm as national security advisor, where Donald Trump could just ignore him, than he did as a guy appearing on Fox News or in the Wall Street Journal op-ed pages, where he actually had a lot of sway over public opinion. So there have been gains in terms of foreign policy, becoming more realistic, more sensible, more restrained on the right, thanks in large part to Donald Trump. But those gains can be lost. And the other thing I'll say is that a lot of the attacks you're going to see, you already see them right now, but they're going to keep increasing, the attacks you see on Donald Trump. They're going to try to, not only go after Trump himself, but Trump is just the window through which they're going to go after everyone who supported Donald Trump, everyone who wanted to see, the kinds of changes that Trump talked about being made in our party. So it's not just going to be Donald Trump who is treated as the loser from last Tuesday. You're also going to, the claim is going to be made that, non-interventionists and realists are the losers, that immigration restrictionists are the losers, that basically anyone who is aligned with Trump is the loser. And there are an awful lot of terrible people in the Republican Party and in the conservative movement who are going to want to take advantage of this opportunity and will try to restore the status quo ante of, the McCain and Romney and George W. Bush years.
Yeah. I think the whole January 6th incident has been an absolute farce. I think the committee was an absolute farce. I don't think the majority of Americans care about it one whit. But I will say it provides an opportunity and a platform to effectively chill and criminalize dissent. I think that's the real goal. The goal is if Trump were more popular, to potentially invalidate him from running again under the, the 14th Amendment, the particular clause of the 14th Amendment, but also under various federal laws. I think the goal here is to basically say that MAGA was an illegal movement, that is beyond the pale in American politics, and that you can go to jail or at least lose your livelihood. I think it's a perfect example of where the left doesn't screw around. They mean what they say in a way that conservatives don't. They're just better at fighting.
That's right, and they're going to be vindictive. So even if Donald Trump, decides next week that he's not going to announce that he's running for president, even if, he decides that he's going to go into retirement on Mount Athos next week and, never make another public pronouncement, never return to Twitter, basically all of Trump's critics and opponents and enemies, they'll continue to use him as a symbol, and they'll say, aha, he's had to retreat in shame because he was leading this illegal movement, this, attempted fascist coup. And, thank God the Republicans have now changed their minds and they're no longer Trumpian. There will be so much strange new respect, showered upon any Republican who says, you know what, the last 5 years have been a total disgrace. We need to go back to the good old days of, nice, honorable George H.W. Bush and his son, George W. John McCain needs to be on the, $5 bill or whatever. That'll happen. So, these battles on the right are going to get more intense rather than less intense, no matter what happens, but basically over the next, 12 months and 24 months as we get towards 2024. I do think, by the way, Trump is going to run again. He doesn't see anything that he's going to lose personally by doing this. And he'll run a pretty, tough, uncivil campaign, let's put it that way, as we've seen in the past. So I think, Ron DeSantis would be well advised right now. Have a thick skin. Don't let Donald Trump bait you. And basically give it time. So you've just been reelected governor. Let's see that you can actually, what you have planned for your second term. Take several months and, rack up those accomplishments. Because you're in office, you can actually establish a good record of governing. Mm-hmm. And, with Donald Trump, we'll see. In 6 months' time, is he going to be more popular than he is now? Is he going to have better poll numbers against Joe Biden than he has now? If he doesn't, then it's going to be very easy for someone, whether that's DeSantis or somebody else, to ride in at the end of 2023 and say, hey, I'm going to save the Republican Party, because clearly the guy who's been your front runner for 6 months is actually consistently behind in all the polls. I mean, it's kind of like what we saw in 2015 and 2016, where when Jeb Bush first announced he was going to explore running for president in early 2015, he basically scared away Mitt Romney. Mitt Romney would have liked to have run for president again after 2012. And he said, oh, but I probably can't beat Jeb Bush. I mean, Jeb Bush, he's got the family name and he's got all this,
what
cachet.
A force.
So, exactly. No, Jeb Bush preemptively, he didn't quite clear the field, but he certainly cleared it of Mitt Romney. And, so there was this time when people thought, oh, man, it's going to be a Jeb, versus Hillary Clinton, another Bush-Clinton race. And, of course, Jeb just never got off the ground. Voters can get pretty tired of, seeing any given politician over and over again. Now, Donald Trump has sort of defied that tendency in the past. He's so entertaining and so shocking that people, don't get sick of him the way they do of others. But, Donald Trump in 2023 isn't in quite the same position as a fresh guy as Donald Trump in 2015, 2016.
Two things can be true simultaneously. One is Trump had to happen. Two is that Trump is played.
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, Trump, again, he is a man who has pulled off the impossible before. In his professional life as well as in his political life. So I'm always reluctant to say, okay, now we know that Donald Trump, really has reached the end of his political tenure. And you've got to keep in mind, he has an enormous amount of popular support among, uncouth conservatives, right? People who were labeled as deplorables by Hillary Clinton. And so even though you see this, sort of great closing of ranks among conservative intellectuals against Trump right now and among, all the Republican Party professionals, I think there's still an awful lot of, grassroots support for Donald Trump. And I have to say that seeing some of the, professional class conservatives and, Republican operatives stake out the positions they have, it's actually probably the one really critical thing I can say about Ron DeSantis right now is that some of the worst people in the world are supporting him, whereas Donald Trump right now, all of the Fairweather friends and Sunshine Patriots are deserting him. So I kind of like that. I like the fact that now it's Trump against the world again, as it was in 2015, 2016. We'll see. And I do fear that in 2015 and 2016. Trump really could talk a lot about how awful the establishment was, the forever wars going on in the Middle East. He could talk about, the crisis at the border and other things. He didn't have to defend a record. Going into 2023 and 2024, now he's got a record, and now he, can't quite separate himself from all of politics the way he could back then. So it is a very different environment and a very different situation for him. But he's done the impossible before, so I'm reluctant to say lightning can't strike twice.
And also, too, I think, if he were to run next week, yeah, he probably would lose, but the country's going to be in a much different spot 2 years from now as things fester, like we've been talking about. I think we all agree things are just going to get worse. And so it may be more, the stakes are going to be higher. And so a lot of people are going to say, yeah, he was the one guy who can stand up to these monsters that are trying to take my kids and and so forth. There's that element. One thing too, Jeff, about the January 6th, what the left, they're very clever. What they managed to do is they now have this term election denier. Mm-hmm. And so now going forward, if anybody questions the legitimacy of an election, that means you are for cops being killed. Mm-hmm. And you're an insurrectionist. Like, just the two are now inseparably linked. So that gives them carte blanche to do all sorts of stuff with shenanigans, and people who are worried about the left's opinion of them are going to now tiptoe around even questioning it because, I can't be an election denier. We all know what that means.
Mm-hmm. And the only thing I'd add, Bob, is that, of course, that will apply to anyone on the right who criticizes or questions an election. It won't apply to Stacey Abrams. It won't apply to all the election deniers, that have been in the Democratic Party for decades.
Right. I'm just saving myself time. Just like, racism is fine if it's, from the left.
From the left, yeah.
Well, Dan, let me begin to wrap this up. Just speak briefly about some of the factions and coalitions on the right. You've got the Adrian Vermeules at Harvard. You've got the Sohrab Ahmaris. He just wrote something in the New York Times yesterday called "Why the Red Wave Didn't Materialize." You've got the American conservative folks and the Quincy folks who are a little more aligned with us on foreign policy. You've got the Claremont folks who basically underwent a pretty radical transformation with Trump. You still have the National Review types. You still have the Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy. You have those types. You still have sort of the faint remnants of a John Boehner House Republican caucus. You've got upstarts. You've got the Marjorie Taylor Greens. I don't know if Lauren Boebert or whatever is going to ultimately prevail in her election. So you got a lot going on here.
Yeah, and it kind of makes the right fun and interesting, as well as obviously very stressful for people who like predictability and homogeneity. So I think these different intellectual schools on the right. You mentioned sort of Sohrab Ahmari, Adrian Vermeule. They tend to identify these days as post-liberal. Oftentimes, the label that's been affixed to them by others is integralists. In a sense, they are sort of representing some of the views that the great L. Brent Bozell had back in the early days of National Review. Brent Bozell was William F. Buckley Jr.'s brother-in-law, brilliant writer, a wonderful soul, very troubled, had bipolar mental disorder, severely alcoholic. But, Brent Bozell was always a very outspoken Roman Catholic who was very critical of modernity as a whole. And with, the post-liberals today, they are a little more, they don't have the, the personal difficulties that Bozell had to bear. And they also have, I think, a more definitive, a program and approach to things. Not so much necessarily in the case of Sohrab Ahmari, who's more of a sort of general big picture guy. Right. But certainly Adrian Vermeule is, he's a professor of administrative law at Harvard University, and he has, particular ideas about using administrative law to further, his ideas, his political ideas, which he sees as being, ideas that are derived from the Catholic tradition. Of course, Vermeule had many of these ideas before he converted to Catholicism as well. He was a great exponent and, supporter of executive power, going back to the George W. Bush years, although he's become very critical since then of the Iraq War. So that's that, constellation on the right. The West Coast Straussians, the people who, have a tradition going back to Harry Jaffa, who, of course, was someone who didn't have all that much appreciation for Murray Rothbard or for, paleoconservatives or paleolibertarians. But the West Coast Straussians, one thing you can always say, and this, in fact, is something that Rothbard actually said about Leo Strauss, who, of course, was the, sort of great teacher and inspiration to Jaffa, is that, the Straussians take seriously the idea of natural right, and they, are enemies of relativism. And Rothbard found it very encouraging that that Strauss was willing to defend the idea of these, theoretical, strict ideas, rational, reasonable ideas of right and wrong. And you see that today with the West Coast Straussians basically looking at what's going on, and they say, well, okay, their view of Abraham Lincoln and of, the Declaration of Independence and other things may be different from that of many paleoconservatives, but quite clearly based on, the sort of natural rights thinking that they see within the Declaration and see Lincoln as championing, these things are not at all what the federal government is doing today. And the federal government, in fact, is very much opposed to the kind of natural rights tradition that the West Coast Straussians value very highly. The other thing, too, is that the West Coast Straussians have always been very perceptive critics of progressivism and of the administrative state, which I mentioned earlier. And so they've always been doing very valuable work there. And I think there's actually now quite a lot of opportunity for crossover between paleoconservatives and Austrian libertarians, Rothbardians, and the West Coast Straussians. Not so much on some of these, basic questions of American constitutionalism, perhaps, which are important, but on, the applications in terms of, what's actually happening in the world right now. And also, ultimately in terms of, what it means to have natural rights or, natural right in the singular. These are great theoretical questions that I think Rothbard would have enjoyed reopening and, re-engaging with folks like Michael Anton, for example, at the Claremont Institute. And then beyond that, you mentioned, a number of, different varieties of Republican politician. Those come and go. You've got, it was very interesting. This past Tuesday in the midterms, you had a pretty good showing for a more, constitutionalist Ron Paul style Republicans. So Rand Paul got reelected easily. Mike Lee in Utah got reelected easily against a terrible neocon, this McMullen character, who was running as an independent because he knew he couldn't win as a Democrat. McMullen is, former CIA officer, Bill Kristol, idol basically. And Lee, crushed him very easily, even though there was a lot of hype, during the election saying, oh, Mike Lee might be in danger here. And then Thomas Massie, of course, has been reelected to the U.S. House of Representatives, and he's one of the best of the best. So I think there's a pretty strong still liberty faction in the GOP as well. You still see some of these Ron Paul Republicans, and there's still a lot of good organization infrastructure in place that could revive that in the future, especially if things like inflation become, a persistent issue. And the Republicans right now are so, sort of inept when it comes to talking about economic issues, some of these foundational questions like inflation, like interest rates, that I think they really need to draw upon people like Ron Paul and Rand Paul if they want to have, articulate positions on these once again. And a lot of the sort of so-called new right, some of the Claremont folks and some of the, post-liberal folks, they just haven't thought a lot about economics per se. They have, sort of moral views or sociological views about economics, but that's different from knowing economics itself and having sort of well-defined positions on things like interest rates or the nature of the Federal Reserve System.
Bob, we'll give you the last word.
Well, I mean, I think what this shows is just having a central plan for how we're going to restore liberty in our country doesn't often work, that there's too many variables going on in it. And it does just show the importance of keeping a wide field of options going and different people working in their areas of expertise.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for joining us. I want to thank Daniel McCarthy for his time. Just tell us real quick, where can people find your Wilmore Kendall book, The Conservative Affirmation?
Okay, well, it is published by Regnery, and you can find it on the Regnery website. You can also find it at Amazon.com. And when you go to Amazon.com, just make sure you're getting the 2022 edition. It's a paperback and not one of the older editions that are still available there.
And right, the new version is what will make the millions and millions of dollars roll into Daniel McCarthy's coffers, right?
Yeah, not hardly, but it does have my work in there, and so I get a little bit of reflected glory from appearing alongside Wilmore Kendall.
All right, well, thanks so much, everybody. Have a great weekend.
Check back next week for a new episode of the Human Action Podcast. And in the meantime, you can find more content like this at Mises.org.